a bad starting point, right? That if you look at what Bruning then meant was the destruction of the political and economic system with all the terrible things that followed. But let's look at what Ron Paul actually proposes. If he's taking the $1 trillion out, this is going to, it's something like, it's somewhere between a quarter and a third of the U.S. federal budget. Right? We had the figures in the previous broadcast, but somewhere between a quarter and a third of the U.S. federal budget would disappear. So let's say it's about a 30% cut. Let's look then at what he wants specifically to cut, and I've tried to go through some of the figures. The interesting thing is when you hear Ron Paul, he says he's got this big anti-militarist, anti-interventionist polemic. He's against foreign wars. So you'd think, well, if he wants to cut 30% out of the federal government, he would certainly cut at least 30% or maybe more out of the Pentagon budget. And the first thing you find, which is very strange, is that he cuts much less, that he spares the Pentagon budget, which I think from his point of view is contradictory. It simply makes no sense. It's incoherent with the things that he says in other parts of his public position. So the general idea is that the Pentagon budget for Ron Paul is going to be cut by 15%, 15%, whereas the rest of the government is going to be cut at least 10% more across the board. It's about, again, between a quarter and a third, so say something like 30%. So the Pentagon budget is going to get cut about half of what you'd expect. So that's already quite a surprise. Now, let's look at the areas that do get cut a lot, and they get cut more than the 30%, say, across the board tendency. Child nutrition. The child nutrition programs of the U.S. federal government. This includes WIC, the Women, Infants, Children programs, which are protein meals for expectant mothers, for nursing mothers, and for infants. This is a very good investment because when you provide sufficient protein and vitamins, what you're doing is avoiding cognitive impairment that can come if babies don't have sufficient protein, nutrition in their diets in the very, very first weeks and months of life. So the U.S. federal government, with all of its worldwide operations, spends $21 billion on WIC. WIC is not fully funded. Not everybody who wants it and needs it can get it, but right now the budget is $21 billion. Ron Paul would cut $7 billion out of child nutrition. $7 billion would disappear. The program would go from $21 billion to $14 billion. This is a 33% cut in child nutrition. I would submit this is a false economy. This is the wrong way to approach this. We'll have some other examples in a minute when we come back on radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. We're looking at Ron Paul's economic program in the light now of the Iowa caucuses. But it's Christmas, and maybe just a few words from the perennial classic of this time of year, the Dickens Christmas Carol. And you remember that when Jacob Marley, the late partner of Scrooge and Marley, 7 years dead, appears to his partner Scrooge, he says, "My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me, in life my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me." And a little bit later on, Scrooge says to him, "You were always a good man of business, Jacob." "Business!" cried the ghost of Marley, wringing its hands again. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. And it is at this time of the rolling year that I suffer most Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down and never raised them to the blessed star which led the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light could have conducted me? And so forth. So, mankind is your business. Mankind is your business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence. That's your salvation. So, let's compare. If we cut the women, infants, children, and related child nutrition by 33%, that's one. Now we have S-CHIP, State Child Health Insurance Program. These are poor families where the parents can't get health care of any kind, but at least in this case, the children can get it. Right now, this is a grand total of $9 billion U.S. dollars. Ron Paul would cut $4 billion of that. He would leave a program of $5 billion U.S. dollars. So that's a 44% cut, significantly more than the 15% cut that the Pentagon is allowed to take. So we're cutting 33% out of child tuition, 44% out of child health, compared to the mere 15% of the Pentagon. But now we get into larger sums when we get to Medicaid. Medicaid is health care for the poor, right? What we ought to be thinking about in terms of the season. It's time to think about charity, or if you want, time to think about Confucian benevolence, or Muslim social solidarity is another good thing to think about at any time of year. Medicaid, two things: health care for the poor and destitute who can't get it any other way, and nursing home care for people in the middle class. Now, this is a program of $276 billion. Ron Paul would cut $95 billion out of Medicaid. That's a 35% cut. Now, I have to think about what's the morbidity and mortality consequences of cutting Medicaid in that way. This is already the last backstop. In other words, when this is gone, there's private charity, I guess, but maybe there's not private charity. And private charities are reporting from food banks to every other kind that they are overloaded. So maybe you might have a hope of getting your operation, but you're going to die while you're waiting for it. And then maybe the most extreme, the food stamp program. This seems to be something that the reactionaries hate more than other programs. Remember this, they want to call Obama the food stamp president. They think it's a scandal that almost 50 million Americans are surviving on food stamps. I think it's a scandal that they need it. But the fact that the program exists, this is a New Deal program. This, I think, began in 1939, 1940. It should have begun much earlier. Right now, the food stamp program is $80 billion U.S. dollars. The Ron Paul budget says cut $50 billion out of the $80 billion. That's a cut of 63%. So the military-industrial complex gets a cut of 15%, but Medicaid is cut 35%, one-third and more, and the food stamp program is cut by almost two-thirds, 63%. What sense does this make in regard to Ron Paul's announced priorities? The stuff that he's built his reputation on, he's gotten his following, including among leftists, based on the anti-militarist stuff. But they take a 15% hit, and these other ones take a greater hit. Now, the Davis-Bacon Act, this I think shows what's going on in another way. The Davis-Bacon Act says that federal construction contracts have to pay a prevailing wage, and it means in practice they have to pay union wages. You can't have $6 an hour construction jobs on a federal construction job. Ron Paul would abolish the Davis-Bacon Act, and he'd say that saves the U.S. government $6 billion. Well, another direct attack on the middle class, because these are construction workers. Today, that's going to pass for the middle class in anybody's book. Ron Paul claims to be a principled opponent of totalitarianism, yet His anti-union policies, in my view, undercut that in a rather severe way, in the sense that he wants to have the right-to-work laws extended to all states. Essentially, it would be a frontal attack on the existence of unions in any and all states of the union. It violates states' rights. Right now, under the Taft-Hartley Act, you can say there's states' rights. You can decide to be a right-to-work state, like the southern states, where the unions are almost impossible to create, or you can be a state like New York State or California or Michigan or Illinois or Massachusetts, where unions are indeed allowed, or Pennsylvania, places like this. But now, Ron Paul and Rand Paul in particular say, no, that's not good enough. We don't want states' rights on that. We want a nationwide right-to-work law so we can bust unions everywhere, no matter what the states say. Now, this is a very interesting thing. The whole business with states' rights always comes down to something else. In this case, I think union busting is the goal. But if you wipe out Davis-Bacon and you extend the right-to-work law to all states, then you have essentially destroyed the only mass organizations that would have any hope of providing a focus for mass resistance against totalitarianism. Obviously, we've got this crisis going on now with civil liberties in the United States. You've got the NDAA, I believe it's called, the totalitarian law that allows Obama to arrest anybody he wants and throw them into Guantanamo if he decides that they're a terrorist. Well, if you wanted to have a general strike against that, where are you going to start? Well, take a look, right? When we had Occupy Wall Street, the moment that became serious was the moment when the transport workers union, the communications workers who were on strike in some places, the teachers union and the transport workers union, when they showed up, then it got to be serious. Then the ruling elite at least had to deploy more counterinsurgency assets in there. Michael Moore and others were sent in to make sure that nothing got out of hand. So if you want to destroy unions, it seems to me you've put the society on the march towards totalitarianism, and I wonder why is that? So look at this budget. Look also at the idea of wiping out the executive departments. 5 executive departments. Right now, the Washington, D.C. area has the best economic growth and the best population growth of anybody in the country. And, of course, once you say this, then the reactionaries begin to say, oh, no, well, that's because that's all the pointy-headed bureaucrats. Well, Ron Paul would take down the Commerce Department, which has been around for quite a while, the Commerce Department, the Housing and Urban Development, Education, Energy, and Transportation. I can't go into now. We've run out of time. I can't go into everything that would be lost. He would also end the entire foreign aid budget, something like $25 billion. And I would submit to you that simply wiping out USAID, they do a lot of evil, but they also deliver a lot of food. And that you might find hundreds of thousands or millions of people around the world dying if the entire U.S. food aid is simply subtracted, disappears from one day to the next. Anyway, best wishes to everyone for Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy any other festivals that are occurring, and we'll see you next week here on World Crisis Radio.